Ni hao, bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite. Ricardo Geromel aqui. Hoje eu tenho um convidado super especial para falar conosco sobre inovação e internacionalização de empresas, que é o John Fargis. Eu conheci o John Fargis na China faz alguns anos e todas as vezes que eu converso com esse cara, aprendo demais. Então apertem os cintos aí que hoje promete. John, sorry for those brief Portuguese words. I know you like the sound of it, but basically, I was just telling everyone what a rock star you are. And guys, so I am Ricardo Geromel. I'm a partner at 3G Radar, a fund I cover tech here. And I could not be more excited to have John Fargis here with us. John, you have lived so many lives. You have so much experience, but I would like you to please introduce yourself. And my friend, it's such a pleasure, such an honor to host you here at Instituto Caldeira. As I told you, and as everybody knows, Instituto Caldeira is the place to innovate. If any of your companies or entities or people want to connect to the best of the best in Brazil related to innovation, look no further than Instituto Caldeira. So go for it, John.
Fabulous. Well, thank you, Ricardo. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really grateful for your invitation and to be with the Institute today. And I think it's a good chance to not only obviously share a little bit about some of what I do, but I'd love to learn more about the mandate of the organization and some of your work as well. And hopefully this can be somewhat interactive, and I can think about how I might be we might be able to push some questions forward and learn more about places internationally that we can that are important to do work in. I'm as Ricardo mentioned, my name is John Fargis. I'm calling in today from the Hudson Valley in New York, which is a lovely area. I grew up in this area. I spent much of the last 25 years living in Beijing, in China. Raised my family there, and conducted my regional business and ultimately my global business out of that part of the world for most of my life. About 2 years ago, relocated here with the intention of being able to go back and forth, which was obviously somewhat curtailed by the pandemic. But that notwithstanding, the work that I do is fortunately pretty fungible, and I've been able to grow a lot of our international efforts, not only in Asia and elsewhere in the world from this part of the world. I run a company called BYG Advantage that was started about 7 years ago. And our mandate is to help bridge companies internationally. Things like sales acceleration, things like engineering and strategy consulting, market entry of one form or another. And originally, a lot of that work that we did was between Silicon Valley and China, but it bridged out considerably over the time that that we've been around, so that now we're doing all sorts of opportunity between Brazil and China, or between Israel and Japan, or between India and Korea. So there's a lot of interesting interplay that wasn't originally part of what we were thinking about. I come out of a background that, as Ricardo suggested, I've had a lot of different iterations. I was first went over to Asia when I was 27. I went to China in '93 as part of a scholarship, and lived in Shanghai at the time. And it was obvious that China was about to go through a pretty dramatic transition, so kind of reorganized a lot of what I was doing to focus on that from that point in my life onward. I've run 3 or 4 different enterprise software companies, Asia business, over my career. So companies that had European or US roots that needed to establish and expand themselves in Asia Pacific. And I was able to do that pretty effectively for a number of these companies, 2 of which got bought out by Google. Another had more of a private equity exit. And so it was about this time, about 8 years ago, where I thought, okay, I'd like to do what I traditionally have done with one company with multiple companies. And so about 7 other people who are like-minded cohort of mine put together this platform, and we've run it ever since. We've worked with maybe 50 different companies over the years, bridging them into Asia in general, and these days helping companies to expand in Brazil and helping companies to expand in Kenya, in Nigeria, in many parts of the world that we hadn't originally anticipated. I would just mention briefly that in addition to the work that I do running this company, BYG Advantage, I also have, once you're the head of your own business, you have the freedom to do other interesting things. So I'm also a professor at the Holt Business School, which is a very interesting kind of decidedly international program with campuses in London and New York and Boston and San Francisco, Dubai, but also Shanghai. And I always taught at the Shanghai campus. I taught things like emerging markets, leadership, and Chinese history. So if those are topics that are of interest to folks, I'm happy to talk about some of that. But in general, Ricardo, that's a quick elevator, if you will, on some of what I've done in the past and how that's led to the creation of BYG Advantage.
Fantastic. The audience may know this, that I wrote a book focused on innovation and tech from China. And John, your fingerprints are all over that book. I first met John in Shanghai and then in Beijing, in Shenzhen. He came to Brazil a bunch of times. He has had several clients in Brazil. But what I'm really, really, really excited, this conversation can go in many directions and probably will. But what I want you to share with the audience, John, is one time that we were talking to an Israeli client of yours. He made a comment that I will never forget, which was, Ricardo, Brazil has the disease. No, it was not disease, the word he used. Brazil has the curse of having over 200 million people. I'm like, wait, that's not a curse. That's a great thing. We have a great internal market. And said, yeah, but that comes with a problem. Here in Israel, we have less than 10 million people. So our business leaders, when they start a company, they must think global, because if they succeed only in the domestic market, it's not big enough. And in Brazil, if you succeed in the domestic market, you created a multi-billion-dollar business potentially, given the size of our country in terms of population, is the 5th largest in the world. So in Brazil, I want to see more Brazilian companies succeeding at a global level. That is one in the south of Brazil that I'm particularly fan of, which is Grendene, that sells in over 100 countries, and you have talked to them a bunch.
Yeah.
So I want you to explore and elaborate, give us some examples on how you help companies going international successfully. Maybe as part of your examples, mention some of your Brazilian clients. And I think that is a few key takeaways that the audience can get. If I want to go global, where should I start? What mistakes should I avoid? You've been dedicating your life to help companies do that successfully. You even mentioned about the couple that were sold to Google thanks to your help. So go for it, John.
Yeah, it's a great sort of question and conundrum to set up, Ricardo. I like it, and it's certainly I have Israeli clients who are they're born internationally. They simply must, and we do great work for them in China, where they are not, and they also have sometimes it's a benefit not to be a U.S. company, and be able to fly a little bit under the radar. There's a lot of sensitivity around U.S. companies, for example, in China at present. But having said that, most of the companies I've worked with have been, traditionally, of course, were U.S. companies that have a big home market. And it's almost a stereotype, but they're, needless to say, there are a disproportionate number of people in my country who don't think internationally at all, think beyond their own borders only tangentially. And so it takes and it's intimidating, and it's often off-putting. And so U.S. companies will often lead with what's most familiar, and they'll start an office in the UK, and they'll try and cover Western Europe, which is obviously an important contiguous market of a sort, and serve that from the UK and get their feet wet. And then they kind of stare in askance at things across the Pacific. Again, U.S. companies in this case. And I think it's fractured, it's complicated. There are unique linguistic and cultural challenges, sometimes even currency challenges that you can't just navigate in a turnkey fashion. So where to go and how to make an impact is often very complicated. So usually that's a good time for me to enter the discussion with a small and medium-sized enterprise that's kind of moving fast, but starting to think realistically about international markets beyond the familiar. And with those sorts of companies, there's some wonderful things that can be done if you're careful and you're judicious. A lot of those companies could really, it's usually two roads before them, right? They could think about, should I open my own office, which is what I did for many companies in my career. You get hired and you staff up an office, and you open something in Delhi, and you open something in Tokyo, and you hire people, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's a lot of sunk cost and commitment to that assumes you already know that this is the best thing to do. Conversely, you can find resellers who will run around and try and sell what you have, along with lots of other things that they're selling. And if they hit it, great. If they don't, it's there's no sunk cost. So those are two pathways. What we try to do is construct something in the middle, which is more of an effort to build teams that represent the company faithfully in market. And that might be, hey, we only want to do Singapore. It might be we have to do China and nothing else. Or it might be a blend of different things. But it doesn't matter. We have coverage that extends in a pretty comprehensive fashion across most major markets. And we would put together teams of credible people who would act on their behalf in market. I think the key value for us, or at least myself and a few other key partners, is these are networks that we've built over career, an entire lifetime. So people I staff or people I've worked with for literally 15 years or 10 years or so. They're people I know very, very well, and there's a lot of trust, right? Because in that part of the world, it's important to remember that contracts are important, and what's written on the paper is critical, but it's not the only way of resolving dispute. There's also what happens between the rule of, not just the rule of law, but also the rule of man. And so being able to have trust and being able to leverage that is sounds like a little predictable, but is actually really important. So all that to say, that speaks to the U.S. story and the U.S. mindset. In my humble experience working with Brazilian companies, I think it's a similar pattern, but some of the pieces on the chessboard are a little different. Brazilian companies, in my limited experience, often obviously will think about what's possible in Southern Cone and neighboring countries. But if they're going to make a decided effort for something that's more of a reach, the U.S. market beckons, and that's important. And certainly there's all sorts of familiarity and predictability and intense competitiveness to the United States. There's nothing wrong with that. In the case of one of the companies that we worked with from Brazil who wanted to go to China, was convinced that they had a market in China. Very, very interesting company out of Curitiba. Were some very, very forward-thinking and, if you will, internationally minded members of their leadership team. And we had a thesis that was, listen, going in and taking their technology, which was good, but not the world's final, statement on disruptive technology. It was good, solid, predictable technology, but it wasn't, let's just say, the absolute best. So does that have a place in China? Can that actually sell? How could that possibly work? We actually were able to get a lot of good things done for them by putting together a strategy that brought them into tier 2 markets, right? So if you went through the front door to Shanghai or Beijing with their particular type of solution, it wouldn't be very useful. But in tier 2 or indeed tier 3 and tier 4 cities, there was a lot of interest in what they did because it was well suited, and it cut out the middle company that they might otherwise have to deal with through their bidding process. And so we were able to introduce them into a number of opportunities that were successful for them. They were shipping product to China. I was very, very glad for that, because at the outset, there was a lot of question about whether this was going to work or not. So, and, you know, I think this is indicative of the fact that there's you're dealing, at least in the case of China, you're dealing with such an enormous and complex and rich marketplace, where there is a market for, you know, cutting edge, blistering edge, you know, sorts of solutions. There's also a huge continental size question of where else good product and good, you know, capacity might just fit in well. So that's not the case for every company, of course, but in this company's case, it worked out nicely. I think it ought to be said too, Ricardo, that, you know, if there's profound ignorance on the part of, there's profound ignorance in the U.S. about China, there's profound ignorance about China, you know, from this side and facing the other direction as well. And if anything, that's even more exacerbated between Brazil and China. People, in my opinion, in China often have a very cloudy understanding, if at all, of what Brazil's all about. And people in Brazil, if you forgive me, often stereotypically have very kind of predictable but limited understanding of what's really going on in China. Hence, there's a lot of, and as a result, a lot of things that might happen don't. It has to be said that there's, as I'm sure you guys all know, there's a considerable amount of attention by some companies that understand Brazil as a critical market and are beginning to focus more on Brazil as an opportunity. Tencent, Ali, Kuaishou, ByteDance, but a litany of other companies, of course. But the point being that China is extremely competitive and capable, and so companies that feel like they might be protected just with their home market, to your earlier point, may be under some challenges eventually from very aggressive and capable outward expanding Chinese companies. Anyway, that's a long-winded answer. Maybe that begins to shed some light on your question, Ricardo.
This is fantastic, and you touched upon so many points that I would like to unpack. But first and foremost, China has been Brazil's largest trading partner since 2009. And it surprises me that a lot of people still think of China as the world's factory, which undoubtedly was and undoubtedly is and will continue to be, but for very different reasons. It was all based in almost, very, let's just call it very cheap labor, to be diplomatic. But now it remains the world's factory based on a very advanced supply chain that integrates a lot of different specific technologies. Just one data point is that China has a population that is 7 times larger than the population of Brazil, and the GDP per capita is about the same as of Brazil. So China remains the world's factory, but it's not based on cheap labor anymore. I just told you why. So one of the topics that you mentioned when you said about the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities, I wanted to explore that concept further, but also is to provoke the audience here to think of China as a place where you can access the world's largest middle class, a place where you can go sell your products and services. And it's very surprising when we look at the numbers, how many Brazilian companies are succeeding in selling to Chinese consumers. I'm always shocked by how little that number is. So it would be fantastic that somebody that is hearing us today says, oh, is there a market for me in China? How can I go about it? So maybe explore a little bit the concepts of tier 2 to tier 5, how that works in China. And also, what would be the initial steps for somebody that is curious about selling their products or services to Chinese consumers?
Sure. So let's see. I guess at the outset, there's it's important to remember that the rapidity with which change has happened over the last 20 years, 25 years, it's absolutely remarkable, the velocity of change. So that you had probably, from a number of 30, 40 million middle-class people out of a population of 1.4 billion. In that time, they were able to move, if you imagine a turnstile that, you're either, before or after, 850, 900 million people through that turnstile, right? I mean, like whatever that is, like 4 times the size of Brazil, 3 times. That's a huge number, right? That's like, US, Western Europe, and Brazil through a turnstile from subsistence level existence to middle class existence in a very short time, incredibly quickly. Now, there are those people spending power. There's a great range within there. In the modern citadels of, Beijing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Shanghai, you have a thin layer of, super rich that can, are a certain kind of market. But in terms of middle class and the cities beyond, there are 50, 60 cities that have over 5 million people. They're huge, cities unto themselves that most of which, would be, cities you might not recognize the names of. But that's a very convincing number of people. It's also very new to this. It's experimental. It's trying many things. It doesn't have set ways of necessarily purchasing things. It's very open to disruptive and new ideas and new ways of learning about and accessing things and information. I suppose that you've got, in addition to the major, tier 1 cities that I referenced, all those other cities have different degrees of permeation. So information about, international products, information about other solutions and other ideas don't always make it out there unless there's a concerted effort to do it. So I guess the key thing for a company that's thinking about going, if it was, in general, Asia Pacific is very broad and complicated. And so it might be that what you do makes, infinitely more sense in an English speaking market where it's easy to manage, like, Indonesia. I don't know. But assuming that you do the analysis and think that China is the market that makes the most sense and not Japan or not, Singapore, then within China, then I suppose, you're looking at something that, it depends. I've tried to bring luxury goods in from Brazil into China, had some very, very interesting, projects around that. That's a very thin layer at the top that, is, I think, accessible through some pretty predictable process, strategic initiatives. Where it comes to, like, introducing something that might be might be more cost conscious and maybe is more applicable to a broader range of people. Thinking through where within this enormous continent size market it makes sense to start. You certainly couldn't cover everything. It's often been quipped that you should really think of China as if it was Europe, right? It's where an old world civilization where Moscow to Lisbon is completely different, and within China there's some degree of homogeneity, but there are also significant differences from north to south, east to west, and everything in between. So you're going to want to focus on a particular area to get started. Maybe that's the Greater Bay Area in the southern part of China. Maybe your solution is better suited, and you want to start first in the greater Yangtze River Delta area. But start in a particular area and decide if the price point and the things that that are important for who you want to reach, and then think through how you want to get to that particular segment of the population. A lot of the work I do is with enterprise software. So with enterprise software, it's about figuring out key verticals and key niches. For consumer, I think obviously you need a social media strategy that leverages WeChat and is able to partner with companies that'll allow you to get your message out safely, collect data, leverage it with regards to people safely and domestically and all of those things. But at first, I think you want to think through, what segment of the population is most interesting to you, and then maybe narrow yourself down geographically to the extent that you're talking about China.
This is gold, John. Thank you so much. So if anybody in the audience has questions, please just write them down and I'll read them to John. I'm putting here his email address if anybody wants to get in touch with him directly. The other thing
to that point,
John,
regardless of whether it has to, on any topic, if there's something that strikes your fancy, please feel free to write me. No hesitation. I would be interested.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Besides helping companies go abroad, I know you have a bunch of clients currently that you have the mandate to help them access the Brazilian market. So you also help international companies to come to Brazil, and that has been growing and growing. So I want to hear a little bit, what does the audience, everyone here is Brazilian, pretty much everyone. How do international companies, when they come to Brazil, what do they love? What do they hate? What would make your life easier? We have a few people in the audience that are related to the government. So what would help your clients to be more attracted to Brazil? Because you pitch them pretty much a lot of countries. Brazil is one of them.
Yeah, I think that, clearly, there's a, standard international business challenges around a VAT, there's challenges around currency, there's challenges around language. I think all those are navigable. And if those weren't, challenging, then, they wouldn't need me. So they can do it themselves. So I try to bring, capable people on our team who can think through and navigating those pieces. I do think there is a strong sense about Brazil's unique position in Latin America, and as a market of preponderance that any company thinking about that part of the world, it would necessarily be their first, if not second, choice of a place to go. I don't know that I have a smart answer for that, Ricardo, other than being able to be transparent and understanding how the business culture works effectively, because and where things are predictable and where not. I think there's a sense of not unlike the United States, there's a sense of strong political shift that can happen from one administration to the next, and understanding that and wanting to have a sense of predictability around that business isn't going to necessarily suffer as a result. Understanding the fluctuation of the real and where it stabilizes and where it's subject to change are things that people want to understand when they talk to me. But I don't know if I have a smart way for anybody on this call to change any of that. So if it excites anybody's imagination, or want to tell me about what I what I don't know, that's also fine as well. But I've been thrilled because I think there's some great talent in Brazil, amazing people who are internationally sophisticated that we work with, and I think it goes a long way to making it navigable for companies that are thinking about your amazing country.
No, fantastic. I think you explained really well. I like one time there was a food-related company that wanted help to expand to China. So I called John and said, "Hey, John, my friends here, this very large food company wants to assess the Chinese market," and he put on the call. The first call with them, the guy that took subway to China. I remember that very well.
Yeah.
So this is the kind of things that John does. And I think in Brazil, you must already have a network of this kind of connections that goes really further. So my goal here, John, is to help and assist and enhance the Instituto Caldeira community to advance. And one thing that Brazil, I really, really look forward to seeing the day where more Brazilian companies will be well known internationally. We have a few, but not a lot of them. Are there any Brazilian companies that you really admire, that you, when you talk to clients, you're like, oh, look at this benchmark?
Well, you were helping to disabuse me of a little bit of my exuberance for Magalu. I thought Magalu was really cool. And I thought the CEO is a fascinating woman and a kind of iconoclast. I appreciate that they're...
Oh, yes, they are. Magalu is a truly fantastic company, and they run. You know what? One thing that Magalu has. Sorry to interrupt you, but just
of course.
One thing that Magalu has that is very unique is it started as an offline company, and it did the transition fairly successfully. A lot of the success case, they either started online or they haven't been doing the transition. So this is one point that I always like to highlight. You know, the Alibabas and the Amazons, they started in the 90s, and with that very data-driven and tech mindset. Magalu started way back then, and has been they have been facing a little bit of turmoil in the public markets as a bunch of the Brazilian companies, but that tends to be Mr. Market is very moody right now. But anyway, sorry to interrupt you, John. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, I think I think that I'm a big fan of Raia Drogasil. I think that's a company that is has a time-honored and well-established presence in Brazil. Has done some obviously important expansion throughout the continent, but has all sort of taken on a very thoughtful and modern way of approaching their own digital transformation. I think that for some companies that are born in the cloud or tech companies to begin with, this is a given. It goes without saying. But for a company that has a long storied history like Raia Drogasil, I think they are a company that that was going to be very difficult for, very challenging to figure out how to navigate the 3.0 version of their company, where their processes and their engagement with both the industry and their consumers was going to have to change fundamentally if they were going to stay competitive. Some of the leadership in that team has been very, very thoughtful about spending time in Israel, spending time in China, spending time in Silicon Valley, trying to very methodically learn about what are best practices internationally, what can be leveraged, what shouldn't be, what's working elsewhere, et cetera. And I think that's the sort of model perhaps for a really mature and thoughtful approach to this challenge, right? Because you don't want to just graft on something out of the blue or apply something wholesale, but you need to be able to honor where you're coming from and have a thoughtful application of best-in-class things from elsewhere. I mean, if you ask me, that for example is a company I know well enough to suggest has some fabulous work in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. World-class people are part of that company. And John, they have more than 2,000 stores. More than 30 million people go through their doors each month. I am very curious and looking forward to seeing what they will achieve with this whole new focus of digitalization, selling more services in their stores. And big fan of some people there. So John, we're reaching the top of the hour here, and I want to be mindful of your time. Is there a topic that when you talk to Brazilians, you see like, oh, they tend to think this, but it's actually that, or a topic that you're like, oh, Brazilians really like to talk about this way of doing business? Or is there anything particular in your interactions with Brazilian business people that are seeking the best of the best from the world in terms of innovation and tech, that when you are about to getting a call with a Brazilian prospect, what do you expect? Oh, this is coming. Is there anything like that? And anything that you think, since the audience, most are Brazilians, that, hey guys, just remember, for instance, here in Brazil, we talk about the complexo de vira-lata. I told you about Machado de Assis, but this was not Machado de Assis. It's another fabulous guy that made up this phrase. But it's basically, we have a tendency. This is fantastic. This is fantastic. This is our Shakespeare, man.
Yeah,
in my humble opinion.
It's on my desk.
Fantastic. Basically, I tell Brazilians that when I talk to Chinese people, they really like doing business in Brazil. And Brazilians are shocked. They're like, why? It's so hard to open a company here. It's so hard to close a company here. And less than 5% of our population speaks English. I cannot even grasp what amount speaks Mandarin. Do they really like? And my answer to them is that it's all relative. Think about doing business in Africa, in a lot of countries in Eastern Europe or Southeast Asia. So the Chinese that I talk to that do global business, they really, when they are told they have to do business in Brazil, they celebrate wildly. And there are a lot of very successful companies from China here in Brazil. So I try to remember this to Brazilians when the topic is internationalization. So I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, let's see. On the one hand, you sparked two thoughts from that suggestion just there. On the one hand, I would say that I think there is a lot of affinity. You're right. That is kind of familiar for Chinese, in that Brazil is a continental-sized country, and with geographic and ethnic complexities that take time to understand and that are wrought over a huge area, on the greater part of the continent. That's very similar to China, right? There's a lot of, you could fill in a library with the differences between the two places, of course. But I think as opposed to Chinese trying to figure out, almost any other country in the region, there's a sort of a certain respect for the magnitude of Brazil and what that means. And so, and you're right, Chinese are well aware of how challenging it is to get things done in their own country sometimes. And if I on the balance, I know there are challenges to getting a company started in Brazil. The challenges getting a company started in China are harder. So on the balance, if you're somewhere else in the world, Brazil's certainly more straightforward in that regard. I'd also maybe take a step back from business in general, but counsel, part of my diatribe on this sort of thing is that there's a lot of misperception about China in the world right now, right? And there's a lot of assumptions about what China's agenda is all about, that China Inc. as a polity is trying to take over the world, or somehow exert its position itself to become a new hegemon and control parts of the world very far from its own home territory. And there's some intelligent people that drive that thesis, and it's not without its proponents. I would say I don't agree, and I think there's a lot of reason historically that informs that decision. That China's interest in protecting its power economically is certainly there, but I don't know that that's backed up by a military imperative in the short term. And that's important to remember. I don't think China's interested in establishing itself as a hegemon in the way that clearly the United States has that role currently. I think they're interested in configuring and revisiting a lot of this standard operating norms of international relations, because they're a rising power, and that's what rising powers do. But if you look at, if you take a step back and look at China historically and compare it to, the progression of Western European civilization that many of us come from, it's rather different. China absorbs its neighbors slowly. It doesn't project power beyond its borders to control and take over people. And I could talk about this for a long time, but I think have an open mind about Chinese companies that are coming and what their agenda is. Certainly they want to make money. That's why they're in business. Certainly they want to burnish China's image. And maybe there's some people that are doing things that are nefarious that you need to watch out for as well. But in general, I'd kind of strongly question this myth, that this shibboleth that China's out to sort of slowly take things over. I don't think that's in their DNA to project their power that way.
Got it. John, we have so much to discuss about China. Some 4 years ago, I remember you sent me a syllabus that you send your students to get ready to learn, to educate themselves about China. If you have any other version of that and you want to share with the audience, please send it my way and I'll share it with everybody.
I'd be happy
There is so much gold in there. But I want to take a small detour because people here know that I am a China head, and the dragon has beaten me. And but I do a lot of business in Japan as well, and there are more Japanese people in Brazil than anywhere else but Japan. So the community here is pretty large. So if you can elaborate a little bit on doing business, people that want to.
I'd love to. Yeah, I mean, I have 5 or 6 clients currently. I have staff people in Japan and drive. It's a very important place for, and it's a remarkable, endless point of comparison to China. What's similar, what's different? It's rather different, obviously. And unlike Brazil or unlike the United States or unlike China, it is not a continental power. It's an island, right? And it has some very particular, unique things that can only happen on that island. It's, the metaphor is that it's like the Galapagos, right? They create amazing, beautiful things that can only survive there. I think there's a ton of affinity implicit in Japan, back and forth to Brazil. Obviously, it's a long and storied history. There's a lot of affinity there. Japanese people have a considerable amount of respect, and there's familiarity that goes back and forth. Japan is is not an easy market to. I think in Japan, if you want to figure out how to work that market, obviously the localization is absolutely critical if it's a consumer product, and I think you need by far and away the most important lesson is patience. If you're going to try and do that convincingly and you're going to dabble, you may as well save your money. If you're going to make a commitment to working it through and establishing your legitimacy there, I think it's even more important than China, where decisions can be kind of fickle and things are changing fast. Japan is going to test you in terms of your loyalty and your reliability and your durability. Are you going to be around if something doesn't work well? But having said that, it's still the world's 3rd largest market economically, period, full stop. It's huge. And the possibilities are limitless for smart companies. They'll be, if you're in a tech space and you have something competitive technologically, they'll obviously want to, put you through the ringer. You better have, world-class technology if you're attempting to win out over someone else that does as well, and have to, explain why Japan hasn't already somehow solved this problem. But but if you can get past some of those, initial roadblocks, the adage about Japan, which is a little bit stereotypical, but I think has some truth, is it's really difficult to get married, but it's impossible to get divorced. So once you're in, you're in. In China, you can get divorced real fast. So, they're different in that regard.
This is a really important concept that I've heard a zillion times from a zillion people. But when you just hear, it's almost hard to believe. But when you are there and you talk to people and you leave that, you understand. This last topic that you said in Japan, once you're in, it's very hard to get out.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to really reiterate that really, 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 it's hard to do a business, but once you close that deal, you will have a partner for a long time, unless that is
it's yours to screw up. Yep.
Yeah, yours to screw up. It is fantastic, John. The reason why John showed that book of Machado de Assis is when he came to Brazil for business, he told me, man, what should I read about Brazil? And I gave him a few tips on business books, but also literature. And I told him to understand the Brazilian soul, in other countries, to understand the soul of the nation, you need to read their literature. In Brazil, I believe you need to spend some time with soccer to understand the Brazilian soul, and music as well. So John really enjoys bossa nova and samba.
Well, and you raise a good point, Ricardo, just right there. And I'll throw in as a last bit, anything you can do if you're going to host Chinese guests, Japanese guests, if you're going to do, put in the basic homework, learn the name of the president, learn the name of a few places, learn the name of a person or two. You know, people appreciate it, you know, and I say that as an American, which are usually the worst of the worst at knowing anything about any place else. So,
well, this is very important. Also, let's talk, you know, Brazil has more or less 500 years of history, and China has more than 4,000 years of continued civilization. So the weight of tradition in that country has nothing to do with the weight of tradition here in Brazil. So the basics, right? When you get a business card and you give that business card and we tell you, oh, give with the two hands. If you only use one hand, it's not that the person is going to slap you on your face, but it's like the person is going to be like, oh, you didn't do the basic homework. Is this person for real? Because think of it, the Chinese market is the most competitive market. The entire planet wants to assess the largest middle class. So just wanted to re-emphasize this point, that doing the basic homework goes a long way. In my experience, John, first meeting between Brazilians and Chinese, the Brazilians are very frustrated because we are under the American, the Western concept of time is money, and I don't have time to lose, and let's talk about business and what we can do and whatnot. And the Chinese, because for many reasons, but because the rule of law is not what we understand, is a key reason. In the first meeting, they want to know you. They want to know if they can trust you. They want to get to know who are you, who is your company, and so on and so forth. And the Brazilians are like, I came all the way here and they want to talk about soccer and my family and their family. Is bullshit. And then the second meeting, the Chinese comes fully prepared, knows everything about their counterpart and their company and the sector, and has a huge dossier and a lot of questions. And the Brazilian came thinking it would be similar to the first meeting and not ready, and ready to just talk amenities and build the relationship. So I've seen that playing a few times, and I always find it so curious. And all it took is, you know, a little bit of homework. So is important. These soft things are actually not that all. It's obvious for you that you do only this for a living. You make these connections, but I think this is important. So John, you know, we're getting in the top of the hour. Anybody that has any questions, just write, please. Do you have anything that you tell every single client when working with you? You want to go abroad? Okay. Or when, how do you do to know if the person is for real or if they're just testing the waters, or, you know, any also key, you as a professor at Hoots is amazing. They had a campus in Brazil for a few years. I don't think they have anymore. I'm not sure. You know, something that you tell all your students, all your colleagues. Is there a few John phrases that we should know?
Well, I guess, you know, methodologically, what I try to always do is, you know, I think, and the value that I would represent is trying to, you know, establish a trusted rapport with the client so that they feel like, because you're their extension of trust, right? I'm putting my good name to say that, hey, this guy Fred Wong, or this guy, you know, Jimmy, you know, Takahashi is a trustworthy person, and, you know, they'll represent your business in a manner that's respectful and effective in this country. So I tend to put a lot in front end in my work, trying to establish rapport. If that means traveling to Brazil and, you know, pre-pandemic, and meeting people and, you know, making them feel comfortable, listening to what the business is all about and touring the business, I'm more than happy to, you know, I always do that. And similarly, you know, being on the road with people and trying to make sure that you're there to explain wherever it is they're traveling to in a thoughtful and measured way. So I think, you know, for whatever, I think you need some degree of human trustworthiness that's bankable. And at least personally speaking, I do my best to try and represent that. Otherwise, I think, yeah, I mean, just the basics, right? I mean, you know, be proud of what you do and be open to learning and have a kind of iterative approach to it, rather than, you know, I think Brazilians are necessarily a little bit more nimble in this regard. I mean, US people often assume they can run the playbook, they can do the same thing they do here, and, you know, they run right into a brick wall. So trying to, if they're open and they're a learning organization, they're able to kind of process new things and become stronger as a result, anything's possible.
Fantastic. And John, before we finish this has been wonderful. As always, I learned so much from you. Usually when John and I get together, it lasts hours and I learn so much. This guy is an expert on Chinese history and culture. He arrived in China in the 90s. His wife is
definitely still a learner too.
His whole family speaks Mandarin perfectly. What a guy. John, do you have any final questions for me, my friend?
Well, I guess the one my one regret is that I didn't get to hear from all the good people on this call. So if you're in earshot, thanks for listening, and I'd be very interested to know about what your work is in general, and if anybody thinks that hey, I'm interested in finding a way to bring what I do to other parts of the world, would love to have that discussion. And similarly, if it's important that Chinese companies going to Brazil know about what you're doing, again, let me know. Maybe there's something smart we can do. But regardless, hopeful that we come out of this period, this pandemic period, with a lot of pent up interest and actually resuming connectivity between places that have been distant, and hopefully that means a lot of the folks on this call will be over in Asia Pacific, checking it out, learning, and ideally making some good business as a result of it.
Fantastic. We shared with the audience your email, and please, anybody that wants to get in touch with John, talk to me. So I hope this was a masterclass to people that want to think and start planning and executing how to take their business abroad. Instituto Caldeira can help you in many fronts. What I have learned with John, that has been doing business in Israel, Japan, China, all over the US, all over Africa, all over Southeast Asia, is that an innovative place is more than innovative people. It needs capital. It needs the role of the government, the role of the military a bunch of times, the role of the academia. And John really knows how to put all of that together for international companies to make the most out of it. I remember in China, a lot of places we went together, they pretty much give you free cash if you bring a business and commit to that region to kick it off. Sure. If you get approved, is way more than just, oh yeah, I'll give you land for you to build your factory. This is that kind of thing for the 21st century. So really, if you're thinking of going abroad, I think John will be a good conversation to have. I would do that. I actually go Instituto Caldeira 2022. John, final remarks, my friend.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate everybody's time. I hope this was useful, and look forward to being able to meet some of you in person. And do let me know if you're coming to New York.
Cheers. Have a great one. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Obrigado.